The rope scratched against Clara Wynn's throat like a promise of death. Standing on the makeshift gallows in Cinder Bluff's dusty main street, she could taste copper and fear on her tongue while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The crowd below jeered and laughed, and their faces twisted with cruel anticipation. But a few pairs of eyes held something else. Pity, perhaps, or shame they couldn't voice in Sheriff Drury's domain. "Gentlemen." Drury's voice boomed across the square, his badge catching the harsh noon sun. "This here debt collector's daughter owes more than she can pay. $500 plus interest plus damages to Mr. Boone's property. Since she ain't got the coin." He gestured toward the noose with theatrical flair. "Well, sometimes payment comes in other forms." Clara's mind raced through fragments of memory, her father's gentle hands teaching her to read by candlelight, his promises that education would set her free. The way he'd held her close the night before, the consumption took him. Papa would be ashamed to see her here, but he'd also understand. She'd fought every step of the way, clawed and screamed when Boone's men dragged her from the boarding house, split Tommy Briggs's lip when he tried to grab more than her wrists. Even now, with death's cold breath on her neck, she wouldn't beg. "Ain't you got nothing to say, girl?" Drury leered up at her, enjoying the spectacle. No pretty pleas for mercy, no tears for the good folks of Cinder Bluff. Clara straightened her spine and looked him dead in the eye. "Go to hell, Sheriff." She spit the glob, landing squarely on his polished boot. The crowd's laughter died. Drury's face darkened like storm clouds, and his hand moved to the lever that would drop the platform beneath her feet. Clara closed her eyes, thinking of Papa's voice reading her favorite psalm about walking through the valley of the shadow of death. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The metallic clink of coins hitting dirt cut through the silence like a gunshot. $500, a gravelly voice called out. Plus interest plus damages. The debt's paid. Clara's eyes snapped open. A tall man in a dusty brown coat stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low, but not low enough to hide the stubble on his lean jaw, or the way his pale eyes swept the gathering like he was cataloging threats. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of weathered look that came from sleeping under stars and eating dust. A leather pouch lay at Sheriff Drury's feet, spilling gold coins into the dirt. Drury's eyes widened, then narrowed with suspicion. "And who might you be, stranger?" "The name's Elias Grayson." The man's voice carried no fear, only a quiet steel that made several onlookers shift nervously. "The girl's debt is paid. Now let her go." For a heartbeat, the town square balanced on a knife's edge. Clara could see Drury's mind working, weighing the gold against whatever other plans he might have had for her. His gaze darted to a heavy-set man near the saloon, Jediah Boone himself, arms crossed, and face unreadable beneath his expensive hat. Boone gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Well now," Drury said slowly, his theatrical manner returning. "I reckon that's the most generous donation Cinder Bluff's seen in years." Tommy cut the girl down. The rope fell away from Clara's throat like a broken chain. She rubbed the raw skin, fighting off waves of relief and nausea as Tommy Briggs fumbled with the knots binding her wrists. When her hands were free, she stumbled down from the platform on unsteady legs, her whole body shaking from the aftermath of terror. Elias Grayson caught her elbow as she nearly fell, his grip steady but gentle. Up close, she could see old scars on his knuckles and newer ones along his jaw, the kind that came from hard living and harder fights. "You all right, miss? I've been better." Clara's voice came out hoarse and smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat, found her fire again. "Why'd you do that? You don't know me from Eve." Something flickered across Elias's face, pain maybe, or memory. "Let's just say I don't like seeing people hurt for debts that ain't fairly owed." The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves as the entertainment ended. But Clara noticed how some of the men lingered, watching Elias with calculating eyes. Near the saloon, Jedediah Boone spoke quietly to two of his hands, their heads bent together in urgent conference. "Stranger." Sheriff Drury approached them, the gold pouch now secured at his belt. "That was mighty kind of you, but I hope you ain't expecting to collect on that investment, if you catch my meaning. Miss Wynn's got a reputation for being difficult. The only thing I'm expecting," Elias replied evenly, "is to see justice done. The debt's paid. That should be the end of it." Drury's smile was cold as winter rain. "Oh, it's the end of something, all right." He tipped his hat mockingly and strode away. But Clara caught the meaningful look he exchanged with one of Boone's men. As the last stragglers headed back to their business, Clara found herself alone with her unlikely savior. The gratitude warred with suspicion in her chest. Nobody did something like that without wanting something in return. In her 19 years, she'd learned that kindness always came with a price, especially from men. "I reckon I owe you a thank you," she said carefully, studying his face for signs of the hunger she'd seen in too many masculine eyes. "But I should warn you, I ain't got nothing to repay that kind of money with, and I ain't the kind of girl who pays debts on her back." Elias actually smiled at that, a quick flash of teeth that transformed his harsh features. "Good. The world's got enough of that kind of transaction already." He glanced around the now empty square, his expression growing serious. "But we should probably move along. I got a feeling your friend Boone ain't done with either of us." As if summoned by his words, Clara heard the soft scuff of boots on the boardwalk behind them. She turned to see two men approaching, Jake Morrison and Pete Dutton, both known for doing Boone's dirty work when regular intimidation wasn't enough. Jake's hand rested casually on his gun butt, while Pete carried a coiled rope that still looked damp with something Clara didn't want to think about. "Well, well." Jake drawled his voice, carrying that particular brand of menace that made smart people cross the street. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero. Mr. Boone would like a word with you both. Tell Mr. Boone the debt's been paid." Elias replied, but Clara noticed his stance shift, slightly weight-balanced on the balls of his feet, like a man ready to move fast. "We got no business with him." Pete chuckled, a wet sound that raised goosebumps on Clara's arms. "See, that's where you're wrong, stranger. Mr. Boone, he's got interests in this here situation that go beyond money. The girl's got value, and you just made yourself valuable too by showing you care about her welfare." The threat hung in the desert air like buzzards circling carrion. Clara felt the familiar clench of fear in her stomach, but this time it was mixed with something new. Anger on behalf of the man who'd saved her life. Nobody deserved to be dragged into her troubles, especially not someone decent enough to throw away $500 for a stranger. "Run," she whispered to Elias, her lips barely moving. "I got friends in town. I can handle this." "The hell you can." Elias's response was quiet but final. "Besides, I didn't come this far to abandon the job half done." Before Clara could ask what he meant by that, Jake's hand had found his gun, and Pete was shaking out his rope with practiced efficiency. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 3 o'clock, like a countdown to disaster. The next few seconds stretched like hours. Jake's pistol cleared leather with a whisper of metal on holster, but Elias was already moving, throwing himself sideways and taking Clara with him as the first shot split the air where they'd been standing. They rolled behind a water trough as Pete's rope snaked through the space above their heads. "Stay down," Elias hissed, drawing his own weapon, a well-maintained Colt that looked like it had seen considerable use. "These boys ain't playing games." Clara pressed herself against the rough wood of the trough, her heart hammering loud enough to wake the dead. The smell of horse water and gunpowder filled her nostrils as another shot splintered wood inches from her face. She'd seen bar fights before, even the occasional shooting, but this felt different, colder, more purposeful. These men weren't trying to scare them. They were trying to kill them. Give it up, stranger. Jake called out, his voice echoing off the buildings. Mr. Boone just wants to talk. No need for anyone to get hurt permanent-like. Elias risked a glance over the trough, then ducked back as another bullet whined past his ear. Men like Boone don't just want to talk, he muttered to Clara. They want to own, to control, to break. I seen their kind before. Something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. There was old pain in his pale eyes, the kind that came from personal experience with predators like Jediah Boone. You know about this, about what they do to girls like me. It wasn't a question, and Elias didn't pretend it was. Yeah, I know. His jaw tightened. Which is why we're getting you out of here one way or another. The sound of boots on wooden steps told them their enemies were flanking around the trough. In another few seconds, they'd be caught in a crossfire, with nowhere to run. Clara's mind raced through the geography of the town square, the general store to their left, the saloon straight ahead, where more of Boone's men might be waiting, the narrow alley between the bank and the blacksmith shop to their right. The alley, she whispered, pointing, leads to the back of the church. Father Miguel might help us. Elias nodded grimly. On 3, stay low and run like hell. He counted off with his fingers, then rose and fired twice in rapid succession. Jake yelped and stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, while Pete dove for cover behind a hitching post. Clara ran. Her skirts tangled around her legs as she sprinted across the open ground, expecting at any second to feel the punch of a bullet between her shoulder blades. Behind her, she could hear Elias laying down, covering fire, the sharp crack of his Colt mixing with the answering reports from their pursuers. The alley's cool shadow swallowed her like a benediction. She pressed her back against the brick wall of the bank, gasping for breath as Elias dove in beside her. Blood seeped from a graze across his left forearm, but his eyes were alert and angry rather than pained. You hit? He asked, quickly checking her for wounds. No. Clara was amazed her voice worked at all. But you are. Flesh wound. I've had worse. Elias was already moving toward the back of the alley where the white-painted walls of St. Sebastian's Church rose like hope itself. Your priest friend, we can trust him. Father Miguel's good people. He's been fighting Boone's influence in town for years, trying to protect folks who can't protect themselves. Clara paused, struck by a sudden thought. That's why they let you pay my debt so easy. They knew they could just take me back later along with your gold. Elias's expression darkened. Maybe. Or maybe they wanted to see who'd be fool enough to interfere with their business. Either way, we stirred up a hornet's nest. The church's back door stood slightly ajar, and Clara could hear the soft murmur of Spanish prayers from within. She knocked softly, 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. It was a code Father Miguel had taught the women of the town, a way to signal distress without alerting unfriendly ears. The door opened to reveal a small, dark-skinned man with graying hair and kind eyes that quickly turned sharp with concern when he saw Clara's condition. Mija, what has happened? You look like you've seen La Muerte herself. Father, this is Elias Grayson. He saved me from... Clara gestured helplessly, not sure how to sum up the morning's events. We need help. Boone's men are hunting us. Father Miguel's face went grave. Without another word, he stepped aside to let them enter, then closed and barred the door behind them. The church's interior was cool and dim, filled with the comforting scents of candle wax and old wood. Near the altar, a handful of women knelt in prayer, their heads covered with black mantillas. Come, the priest said quietly, leading them toward a side chapel. We must speak quickly. I fear our time grows short. As they walked, Clara noticed the other women in the pews. She recognized Maria Santos, whose daughter had disappeared 3 months ago after refusing Boone's offer of employment. There was Ruth Carpenter, whose husband had been found dead in the desert after challenging Boone's claim to his gold stake. And in the front pew, Annie Fletcher sat with her twin girls, all three of them, bearing the yellowish marks of healing bruises. Mujeres valientes, Father Miguel murmured, following Clara's gaze. Brave women who have nowhere else to turn. Senor Boone's influence spreads like a poison through our community. But these women still find strength in faith and fellowship. In the side chapel dominated by a statue of Saint Sebastian pierced with arrows, Father Miguel turned to face them. His expression was grim but determined. Clara, I have been expecting this day. Not today specifically, but I knew Boone would eventually move against you directly. Your father's death freed him from the last restraint on his ambitions. My father. Clara frowned. Papa was just a clerk. He kept books for the mining company. And in doing so, he learned things, saw records that revealed the true scope of Boone's operations. Father Miguel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The missing girls, the corrupted contracts, the payments to officials in Tucson and Phoenix. Your father was gathering evidence, preparing to contact the territorial marshal when the consumption took him. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. You're saying Papa was killed. I'm saying the timing of his illness was convenient for certain parties. And I'm saying you are in greater danger than you know, because Boone fears what your father might have shared with you before he died. Elias stepped forward, his pale eyes intense. Father, what exactly are we dealing with here? Is Boone just running girls? Or is there more to it? The priest studied Elias for a long moment, as if weighing how much to trust this stranger. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. Come. There is something you must see. He led them to a door behind the altar that Clara had never noticed before, hidden in the shadows cast by a hanging crucifix. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Father Miguel lit a candle from the altar and guided them down into what appeared to be a basement that extended much further than the church's foundations should have allowed. These tunnels date back to the Spanish missions, Father Miguel explained as they walked through corridors carved from the living rock. They were used to hide from Apache raids, but in recent years they have served a different purpose. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, where the candlelight revealed a sight that made Clara's stomach turn. The walls were lined with crude cells, most empty, but some still bearing evidence of recent occupation chains, filthy blankets, scratches in the stone that might have been calendar marks or cries for help. Dios mío, Clara whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. Boone uses these chambers to hold girls before they're transported east. Father Miguel continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. Some go to mining camps in Colorado, others to brothels in Denver or St. Louis. A few, the prettiest ones, disappear entirely, sold to private buyers whose names I dare not speak aloud. Elias knelt beside one of the cells, running his fingers over deep gouges in the stone. How many? Dozens over the past 2 years. Girls from town, girls from the mining camps, even some from as far away as Tucson. They vanish, and their families are told they ran off or died of fever or were taken by bandits. The priest's voice cracked with emotion. I try to help when I can. But I am only one man, and Boone has too many allies, too much power. Clara sank against the tunnel wall, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Her father hadn't just been a simple clerk. He'd been trying to expose a network of slavery and murder that stretched across the territory. And now she'd inherited his burden, along with the target on her back. There's more, Father Miguel said quietly. Show her the papers, Senor Grayson. Clara looked up sharply. How do you know his name? I just introduced him to you 5 minutes ago. Elias was very still, his face unreadable in the candlelight. Slowly, he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document that bore the seal of the territorial government. Because Father Miguel and I have been in correspondence for several months. I came to Cinder Bluff specifically to find you, Clara. The betrayal hit her like a slap. You lying bastard. This was all planned. The rescue, the chase, everything. Not the rescue. When I saw you on that gallows, I acted on instinct. But yes, I came here looking for you. Elias's voice was steady, but his eyes were pained. Your father reached out to the territorial marshal's office before he died. He sent letters describing Boone's operation and requesting federal assistance. I'm a Deputy Marshal Clara. I've been hunting Boone's network for over a year. Clara felt like the ground was tilting beneath her feet. Everything she'd thought she knew about the last few hours was crumbling like sand castles in the tide. So, what am I to you, beta witness, to be protected until you can use my testimony? You're a person who deserves justice, Elias replied quietly. And you're the daughter of a brave man who died trying to do the right thing. I won't lie to you again, I did come here with an agenda. But what happened up there on that platform, that was real. Nobody deserves to die for someone else's greed. Before Clara could respond, the sharp crack of splintering wood echoed down from the church above. Father Miguel blew out his candle, instantly plunging them into absolute darkness. In the sudden silence, they could hear voices, rough, angry, demanding. Where are they, priest? Don't make us tear this place apart board by board. It was Jake Morrison's voice, thick with pain and fury. The shoulder wound Elias had given him hadn't improved his mood. I know nothing of whom you speak. Father Miguel's voice drifted down to them, calm and steady despite the circumstances. This is a house of God. You have no right to bring violence here. Rights. Pete Dutton's laughter was ugly. The only rights that matter are the ones backed up by gold and guns, old man. And Mr. Boone's got plenty of both. The sound of something heavy crashing to the floor made Clara flinch. They were tearing the church apart, looking for the hidden entrance. It would only be a matter of time before they found it. The door wasn't well concealed from someone conducting a thorough search. Now this way. Father Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the profound silence of the underground chamber. He guided them deeper into the tunnel system, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every twist and turn by heart. They crept through the darkness like mice fleeing a house fire, feeling their way along walls that wept with condensation and stepping carefully over loose stones that might betray their passage. Behind them, the sounds of destruction grew louder, pews being overturned, confessional booths splintered, holy relics smashed in casual sacrilege. The tunnel system was more extensive than Clara had imagined, with branches leading off in multiple directions. Some passages had been blocked by cave-ins or sealed with mortared stone, but others stretched away into depths that suggested they might connect to other buildings, maybe even extend beyond the town itself. Where does this lead? Elias whispered as they paused at a junction of 3 corridors. The left passage goes to the old Spanish fort on the hill. The right goes to the cemetery. Straight ahead. Father Miguel hesitated. Straight ahead goes to Boone's mansion. It was how he was able to use these chambers. Without arousing suspicion, his victims were brought directly from his estate to their prison, never seen on the streets. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground dampness. Then we go right. To the cemetery. No, mija. Father Miguel's voice was sad but firm. The cemetery exit has been sealed for months. Boone discovered it and had his men fill it with stones and cement. He couldn't risk his prisoners finding a way to escape or investigators finding a way in. Then the fort also watched. Boone has men posted there during daylight hours. The priest paused, considering their options. There is one other way, a passage that connects to the old mine shaft behind Martha Hendricks's boarding house. But it's dangerous. The mine was abandoned for good reason, and the tunnel might not be stable. From somewhere behind them came the sound of triumphant shouting. They'd found the hidden door. The mine it is, Elias decided. Lead the way, Father. They moved faster now, abandoning stealth for speed, as boots echoed in the tunnels behind them. Father Miguel led them through a maze of interconnected passages, some so narrow they had to walk single file, others opening into chambers that suggested this underground network had once been much more than a simple hiding place. The passage to the mine was everything Father Miguel had warned and worse. The walls were rough-hewn and unstable, supported by timber that had been weakening for decades. Water dripped constantly from overhead, and the air tasted of rust and decay. Twice they had to detour around sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving piles of rubble that forced them to crawl on hands and knees. This mine. Clara gasped as they squeezed through a particularly narrow gap. What happened to it? Why was it abandoned? Cave-in. Father Miguel replied grimly. 7 men died when a support beam failed. The owners sealed it up rather than pay for proper safety measures. But that was 15 years ago. I helped dig the original connecting tunnel as a young man. When the church needed a secure route to smuggle food to Apache refugees the army was hunting. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Jake and Pete had found their trail and were following it with grim determination. Clara could hear Pete cursing as he scraped against the narrow walls, and Jake's labored breathing as his wounded shoulder protested the physical exertion. The tunnel began to slope upward. And gradually, the oppressive sense of being buried alive gave way to something that might have been hope. Fresh air moved against Clara's face, not much, but enough to suggest they were approaching an exit. There. Father Miguel whispered, pointing ahead to where a faint square of light outlined what appeared to be a trapdoor. Martha's root cellar. But be careful, if she has boarders in the kitchen above, they might hear us. Elias moved past them to test the trapdoor. It creaked ominously, but opened, revealing a cramped cellar filled with barrels of salt pork and sacks of flour. Sunlight slanted down through another door at the top of a short flight of wooden steps to the entrance to Martha's kitchen. They climbed carefully, trying to minimize the squeaking of old boards. At the top, Elias pressed his ear to the door and listened for several seconds before easing it open a crack. The kitchen was empty, but Clara could hear voices from the front of the house, Martha talking to someone, her tone polite but strained. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'm sure you understand our position," a cultured voice was saying. It wasn't Jake or Pete. This was someone else, someone with education and authority. "Mr. Boone simply wants to ask Miss Wynne a few questions about her father's business dealings. Nothing more sinister than that." Martha's response was tart. "And I'm sure you understand mine, Mr. Cross. This is a respectable boarding house, not a way station for bounty hunters. If you want to search my property, you can come back with a proper warrant." Clara recognized the name. Samuel Cross was Boone's lawyer, a smooth-talking man from back east who'd arrived in Cinder Bluff about 2 years ago. If Cross was here personally, it meant Boone was taking the situation very seriously indeed. Elias motioned for them to stay put while he slipped into the kitchen proper. Through the cracked door, Clara watched him move with practiced silence to the back entrance, checking the yard for signs of surveillance. When he returned, his expression was grim. "2 men watching the back," he reported in barely audible whisper. "Front's covered too, from what I can see. They've got the place surrounded." From the front room, Cross's voice continued its civilized menace. "Mrs. Hendricks, I hope you won't make this more difficult than necessary. Mr. Boone is prepared to be very generous to those who cooperate with his legitimate business interests, and very hard on those who don't, I imagine." Martha replied dryly. "Well, Mr. Cross, you're welcome to sit in my parlor until kingdom come, but I can't help you find people who aren't here." Father Miguel touched Clara's shoulder. "Senora Hendricks is buying us time, but it won't last long. Cross is too smart to be fooled by brave words when his men are searching the building systematically." As if to prove his point, the sound of boots on stairs echoed through the house. They were checking the second floor first, working their way down. It would be only minutes before someone thought to examine the cellar. The mine, Clara said suddenly. We go back into the mine shaft itself. Not the tunnel, the actual mine. They'll think we went through and came out here, but we'll be hiding in the last place they'd look. It was a desperate plan, but Elias nodded slowly. Dangerous, but it might work. If we can stay hidden until dark, we might be able to slip out of town. They retreated back through the cellar and down into the tunnel system, moving as quickly as they dared. Behind them, Clara could hear Cross's voice rising in frustration as his search turned up nothing. The sound spurred them forward through the treacherous passage toward the abandoned mine. The mine itself was a horizontal shaft that extended deep into the hillside, supported by increasingly rickety timbers as it progressed into the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the metallic taste of old ore, and every step sent small stones rattling away into unseen depths. Not too far. Father Miguel warned as they felt their way deeper into the shaft. The collapse zone begins about 50 yards in. Beyond that, the tunnel is completely blocked. They found a relatively stable section about 30 yards from the entrance, where a side chamber had been carved out to store equipment. The space was cramped but defensible, with only one way in or out. More importantly, it was hidden from casual observation by anyone entering the main shaft. They settled in to wait pressed together in the dusty darkness while the sounds of the search continued overhead. Clara found herself acutely aware of Elias beside her, the warmth of his body, and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Despite his deception about his identity, she was beginning to trust him in ways that surprised her. There was something solid about him, something that suggested he'd keep his word once given. "Tell me about my father," she whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear. What did his letters say? Elias was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with respect. He said he'd discovered something that sickened him to his soul. That innocent people were being hurt, and he couldn't stand by and let it continue. He knew reaching out to federal authorities might get him killed, but he did it anyway, because it was the right thing to do. He never told me any of this, Clara murmured, feeling a complex mix of pride and sorrow. I thought he was just Papa. A quiet man who liked books and taught me to read and worried about having enough money for medicine. He was protecting you, Father Miguel said softly. The less you knew, the safer you would be. But after his death, that protection was lost. Boone began to worry that your father had shared his evidence with you, or hidden documents where you might find them. Did he hide documents? I don't know. The letters to the marshal's office were general descriptions, not specific evidence that could be used in court. If your father had detailed records, proof of payments and transactions, they would be invaluable for building a case against Boone. Clara closed her eyes, trying to remember her father's final weeks. He'd been so sick, so focused on making sure she'd be able to take care of herself after he was gone. But there had been odd moments, times when she'd caught him burning papers in the fireplace, or when he'd seemed to be checking and rechecking the same ledger entries. He burned a lot of papers near the end, she said slowly. I thought it was just cleaning house, getting rid of old work documents so I wouldn't have to deal with them after he passed. But maybe he was destroying evidence that could have gotten you killed if Boone found it. Elias finished. Your father was smarter than any of us gave him credit for. The sound of boots in the tunnel below made them all freeze. Someone had found the connection to the mine and was investigating. Clara held her breath as the footsteps approached, trying to make herself smaller in the cramped hiding space. Anything, a voice called from the tunnel entrance. Nah, came the reply from deeper in the mine. Just a played-out hole full of bad air and rotten timber. Nobody's been in here for years. The footsteps retreated, and gradually the sounds of the search moved away from their hiding place. They waited another hour before daring to speak again, listening to the muffled voices and activity from the town above, as Boone's men continued their increasingly frustrated hunt. As the afternoon wore on and the light filtering down from the surface began to fade, Father Miguel stirred restlessly. "I must return to the church," he whispered. "The women there depend on me. And if I stay missing too long, Cross will know I helped you escape." "It's not safe," Clara protested. "They'll question you." "They will question me regardless. Better that I'm there to deflect suspicion than hiding here while they tear apart my church looking for evidence of my involvement." The priest's voice was steady, but Clara could hear the fear underneath. "Besides, someone needs to warn the others. If Boone is moving this aggressively against you, he may decide to clean house entirely." The thought of Maria Santos and the other women facing Boone's wrath sent ice through Clara's veins. These were people who'd shown her kindness when she had nothing, who'd shared what little they had, despite their own desperate circumstances. "We can't just hide while other people get hurt because of us," she said, looking at Elias in the dim light. "There has to be something we can do." "There is," Elias replied grimly. "We can finish what your father started. Gather evidence, contact the territorial capital, bring federal marshals with enough authority to arrest Boone and his entire network." And how exactly do we do that while half the town is hunting us?" Elias was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing options and risks. "There's someone else involved in this. Someone I haven't told you about yet because I wasn't sure we could trust each other. But if we're going to survive the next few days, you need to know everything." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "More secrets? Sheriff Drury isn't just Boone's lapdog," Elias said carefully. "He's also been feeding information to the territorial marshal's office. Not out of any sense of justice, he's covering his own skin, positioning himself to survive when Boone's empire comes crashing down. But his intelligence has been valuable." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Drury, the man who was about to hang me this morning, had to maintain his cover. If he'd shown you any mercy, Boone would have known immediately that something was wrong. The hanging was brutal theater, but necessary to keep his position secure. Clara thought back to that morning, trying to process this new information. Drury's casual cruelty, his enjoyment of the crowd's bloodlust, the way he'd savored her fear and defiance. If that had been an act, it was disturbingly convincing. "You're saying he knew you were coming, that the rescue was planned?" "No. Drury knew a federal marshal was in town, but he didn't know it was me, and he had no idea I'd interfere with the execution. When I threw down that gold, I surprised him as much as anyone else." Father Miguel shifted uncomfortably. "This is dangerous knowledge, mijos. If Boone discovers that Drury has been playing both sides, then we make sure he doesn't," Elias said firmly. "Drury's risking his life to gather evidence from inside Boone's organization. The least we can do is not get him killed through carelessness." As night fell over Cinder Bluff, the three of them prepared to leave their hiding place. Father Miguel would return to his church and try to maintain the fiction that he knew nothing about their whereabouts. Clara and Elias would attempt to make contact with Sheriff Drury and coordinate their next move. It was a plan born of desperation and held together by hope, but it was the only option they had. The alternative was to run to abandon the women in Father Miguel's congregation, to let Boone's network continue its evil work, to let her father's sacrifice be meaningless. Clara Wynne had never thought of herself as particularly brave. She'd survived her father's illness and death through stubbornness, more than courage endured Boone's harassment through anger rather than heroism. But as she prepared to step back into a town that wanted her dead or worse, she realized something fundamental had changed inside her. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was trying to fight back. The climb out of the mine was treacherous in the darkness, with only starlight to guide their steps. They emerged into a world transformed by night, familiar buildings rendered strange and threatening by shadow, every sound magnified and suspicious. The town that had been her home for 19 years now felt like enemy territory. Father Miguel departed first, slipping away through back alleys toward his church. Clara watched him go with a mixture of gratitude and terror, knowing that if their plan failed, the gentle priest might pay with his life for helping them. "Earth this way," Elias whispered, leading her away from the town center toward the small adobe building that served as both jail and sheriff's office. "We'll approach from the back through the alley. If Drury's alone, we can risk making contact. If not, we're back to hiding in mine shafts and hoping for the best." The sheriff's office was dark, except for a single lamp burning in the front window. As they crept closer, Clara could see Drury himself sitting at his desk, apparently working on paperwork by lamplight. He was alone, but that didn't necessarily mean it was safe. Boone's men could be watching from any of the surrounding buildings. Elias studied the scene for several minutes before making his decision. "I'm going in. You stay here and keep watch. If anything goes wrong, run. Don't try to help me, just get out of town any way you can." "Like hell," Clara whispered back. "We're in this together now." Before he could argue, she was already moving toward the back door of the sheriff's office. It was unlocked, either an oversight or a deliberate signal. Clara slipped inside with Elias close behind her into a small room that smelled of coffee and tobacco, and the particular staleness that came from too many desperate people passing through over the years. Sheriff Drury looked up as they entered his hand, moving instinctively toward his gun, before recognition stopped him. In the lamplight, his face looked older and more careworn than it had that morning, as if the day's events had aged him years in the span of hours. "Deputy Marshal Grayson," he said quietly, not bothering with surprise or reproach. "I wondered when you'd turn up. And Miss Wynne, I'm glad to see you're still breathing." "No thanks to you," Clara replied, unable to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "That rope felt real enough around my throat." Drury's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, regret perhaps, or simply weariness. It had to look real. "Boone's been suspicious of me for months. If I'd shown you any mercy, he'd have known I was compromised." "You could have warned her," Elias said coldly. "Found a way to get word to her, given her a chance to run. And tipped off Boone that we were on to his plans. Miss Wynne wasn't supposed to be at that execution. She was supposed to be on a stage to Tucson, safely out of the way, while we gathered the evidence we needed to bring him down." Drury's voice carried the weight of frustration and failed plans. "But Boone moved faster than we expected. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to do anything but play my part and hope you'd arrived in town like we planned." Clara sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the realization that her near-death experience had been the result of miscommunication and poor timing, rather than deliberate malice. It didn't make her feel any better about having a noose around her neck, but it did explain some of the confusion she'd sensed in the crowd that morning. "So what now?" she asked. "How do we stop Boone without getting everyone in town killed in the crossfire?" Drury leaned back in his chair, looking every one of his 50-odd years. "We've got enough evidence to arrest him on federal charges, but not enough to guarantee convictions. Boone's smart, he keeps his hands clean, uses intermediaries for the dirty work. What we really need is someone who can testify to his direct involvement in the trafficking operation. What about the women he's hurt? Surely some of them would be willing to testify. The ones who are still alive are too scared, and the ones who might talk are..." Drury shrugged helplessly. "Well, let's just say Boone doesn't leave loose ends." The casual way he discussed murder made Clara's skin crawl, but she forced herself to focus on the larger problem. There has to be someone close enough to Boone to have seen him give orders, handle money, make decisions. Elias had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he leaned forward with interest. "What about his bookkeeper? Someone has to manage the finances for an operation this size." "Sarah Mitchell," Drury said immediately. She's been handling Boone's accounts for about 18 months. Smart girl educated back east before her family lost their money in the Panic of '73. She keeps track of every dollar that flows through his various businesses. Clara knew Sarah by sight, a quiet woman in her mid-20s who'd arrived in Cinder Bluff around the time the disappearances started getting worse. She'd always seemed nervous jumpy, the kind of person who looked over her shoulder a lot and didn't make eye contact in casual conversation. I think she'd be willing to help us. Maybe. If she thought she could survive it. Drury rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Sarah's got a younger sister in Denver, Emma, about 16. Word is that Boone's been making veiled threats about Emma's safety to keep Sarah in line. The implications made Clara's stomach churn. He's using her sister as leverage. It's his standard method of control. Find what people care about most, then threaten to destroy it. Works better than simple intimidation, lasts longer than physical violence. Elias stood and began pacing the small office, his mind clearly working through possibilities and problems. If we could guarantee Emma's safety, get her out of Denver, and somewhere Boone can't reach her, Sarah might be willing to testify. Big if, Drury pointed out. Boone's got connections throughout the territory. There aren't many places a 16-year-old girl could hide that he couldn't find her. What about federal protection witness relocation? Possible, but it would take time to arrange. Weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, both Sarah and Emma would be at risk. Clara listened to this discussion with growing frustration. Every potential solution seemed to founder on the rocks of Boone's far-reaching influence, and the simple reality that they were three people trying to take down an organization with tentacles throughout the territorial government. There's another option, she said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. We don't wait for perfect conditions. We force Boone to make a mistake, expose himself in a way that even his connections can't protect him from. Both men looked at her with interest and concern. What did you have in mind? Elias asked. We make him think he's won, that he's eliminated the threat we represent. Let him get confident, maybe even reckless. Clara's mind was racing now, pieces of a plan falling into place. What if word got out that we'd been killed trying to escape town, that the problem had been solved permanently? Drury frowned. You want to fake your own deaths? I want to disappear in a way that makes Boone think he's safe. Let him start moving his operation again. Maybe bring in new girls, handle money personally, instead of delegating everything to subordinates. Give us a chance to observe him directly and gather the kind of evidence that will stick in court. It was a dangerous plan, requiring them to go underground completely while maintaining surveillance on Boone's activities. But as they discussed the details, it began to seem like their best option for gathering the evidence they needed without getting half the town killed in a premature confrontation. The plan required Sarah Mitchell's cooperation, which meant approaching her without alerting Boone to their interest. It also required finding a secure base of operations somewhere they could hide while conducting surveillance. Most importantly, it required perfect timing. They'd have to maintain the fiction of their deaths while gathering evidence quickly before Boone decided to relocate his operation or eliminate potential witnesses. I can handle the death reports, Drury said. Stage a scene out in the desert plant, some blood and torn clothing, make it look like you were killed trying to escape, and your bodies were dragged off by coyotes. Boone will want confirmation, but he'll be satisfied if the evidence is convincing enough. And I can approach Sarah, Clara offered. She's more likely to trust another woman, especially one who's been targeted by Boone herself. Elias looked skeptical. That puts you at considerable risk. If Sarah panics and runs to Boone, then we're no worse off than we are now. Clara replied firmly. And if she agrees to help us, we might actually have a chance of bringing him down. They spent the next hour refining their plan, working out details of timing and communication. By the time they were finished, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. In a few hours, Cinder Bluff would wake to the news that Clara Wynne and the mysterious stranger who'd tried to save her had been found dead in the desert and their bodies torn apart by scavengers. It was a good plan. It might even work. The only problem was that none of them had considered the possibility that Jediah Boone might have his own plans for Clara Wynne, plans that didn't require her to be alive to fulfill. As Clara and Elias prepared to leave the sheriff's office and begin their masquerade as dead fugitives, Boone was already setting in motion a series of events that would test their resolve, their trust in each other, and their ability to survive in a world where the difference between justice and vengeance was often measured in blood. The fake death scene was staged in a narrow canyon about 5 miles outside of town, a place where flash floods had carved deep channels in the red rock and scattered the bones of less fortunate travelers. Drury had chosen the location carefully isolated enough to be believable, as a place where desperate fugitives might have made their final stand, but accessible enough for his men to discover the evidence without too much difficulty. Clara contributed a blood-stained piece of her dress and a lock of her hair, while Elias provided his hat and a substantial amount of blood from a deliberately reopened wound on his arm. They scattered these items around the canyon floor, along with spent shell casings and gouges in the rock that suggested a fierce gunfight. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout Cinder Bluff that the fugitives had been found dead, their bodies apparently dragged away by coyotes before Drury's posse could reach the scene. The town's reaction was mixed relief from those who'd feared a prolonged manhunt, disappointment from those who'd hoped to see a more public resolution to the drama. Jediah Boone's reaction was more complex. He studied the evidence, personally questioning Drury and the men who'd discovered the scene. But instead of the satisfaction his subordinates expected, he seemed troubled by something he couldn't quite articulate. "You ain't too clean," he muttered to Samuel Cross as they stood in his private office, maps of the territory spread across a mahogany desk imported from San Francisco. Too convenient. That girl had more fight in her than to go down easy in the stranger. There was something about him that didn't sit right. Cross adjusted his spectacles and consulted a sheet of notes. The evidence appears conclusive. Blood personal effects signs of a significant struggle. Even if they survived the initial confrontation, the desert would have finished them within hours. Maybe. Boone wasn't convinced, but he also couldn't afford to waste resources chasing ghosts when he had other pressing concerns. Double the security on the transportation routes. If they're really dead, we'll know soon enough by whether anyone else comes looking for them. If they're alive, he let the sentence hang, but Cross understood the implication. Meanwhile, Clara and Elias had established their hideout in the ruins of an old trading post about 10 miles from town. A building that had been abandoned after Apache raids made the location too dangerous for regular commerce. The structure was partially collapsed, but it offered shelter from the elements and concealment from casual observation. More importantly, it was positioned on high ground with clear sight lines toward the main road between Cinder Bluff and the railroad town of Silver Creek. If Boone resumed his trafficking operations, believing the threat to be eliminated, they'd be able to observe the movement of wagons and riders between his base and the transportation network that carried his victims to markets throughout the territory. The first few days were the hardest. They had limited supplies, no reliable source of water, and the constant stress of maintaining absolute secrecy. Any sign of habitation smoke from a fire horses grazing nearby, even footprints in the wrong places, could give away their position and destroy the carefully constructed fiction of their deaths. But gradually, they established a routine. Elias would conduct long-range surveillance during daylight hours, using a telescope liberated from the trading post's remaining equipment to watch for activity on the roads and around Boone's known properties. Clara worked on approaching Sarah Mitchell using the network of sympathetic women that Father Miguel had quietly introduced her to over the years. The approach to Sarah had to be indirect and carefully orchestrated. Martha Hendricks, who cleaned Boone's offices twice a week, was able to pass a message suggesting a meeting. Maria Santos, whose own daughter was among the disappeared, provided intelligence about Sarah's movements and daily routine. Even Annie Fletcher, despite her own troubles with Boone's enforcers, was willing to serve as a lookout during the crucial conversation. The meeting took place in the ruins of the old Spanish church on the hill overlooking town, a structure that had been abandoned in favor of Father Miguel's newer building, but was still occasionally visited by people seeking privacy for prayer or contemplation. Clara waited in the crumbling nave as evening shadows gathered, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps on the broken stone floor. Sarah Mitchell appeared exactly on time, her movements nervous but determined. She was smaller than Clara had remembered, with prematurely gray hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But there was steel in her bearing, the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving impossible circumstances through sheer force of will. "You're supposed to be dead," she said without preamble, settling onto a broken pew with careful attention to the sight lines that would allow her to spot trouble approaching. "So are a lot of people in this town," Clara replied. "The question is whether we're going to stay that way, or whether we're going to do something about the man who's been making corpses of anyone who crosses him." Sarah's laugh was bitter and tired. "You think I haven't thought about that? You think I enjoy keeping books for a man who traffics in human misery? But Emma—" her voice broke slightly on her sister's name. "Emma is all I have left in this world. Boone made it very clear what would happen to her if I ever betrayed his trust. What if we could get Emma to safety somewhere? Boone couldn't reach her with federal protection until this is over. You're talking about witness protection. That's not something you arrange overnight, and even if you could, how do I know you're not walking into the same trap that got your father killed?" The mention of her father sent a spike of pain through Clara's chest, but also strengthened her resolve. "Because this time we're not working alone. This time we have federal marshal's evidence and a plan that doesn't depend on one person carrying the whole burden." She spent the next hour outlining what they knew about Boone's operation and what they needed from Sarah to build a case that would stick in federal court. As she talked, she could see the other woman's expression change, fear giving way to hope, resignation, transforming into something that might have been determination. "You're asking me to bet my sister's life on the competence of territorial law enforcement," Sarah said finally. "That's not a wager I'm comfortable making. I'm asking you to bet her life on the idea that Boone won't just kill her anyway once he doesn't need you anymore." Clara replied bluntly. "How long do you think he'll keep her alive after his operation is established enough that he can find another bookkeeper?" It was a harsh truth, but one that Sarah had clearly been avoiding. Her face went pale in the moonlight, streaming through the ruined church's empty windows, and Clara could see the moment when hope began to outweigh fear in the other woman's calculations. "What exactly would you need from me? Financial records, transportation schedules, lists of contacts in other cities. Anything that proves Boone's direct involvement in trafficking rather than just profiting from brothels and gambling halls." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, there was something in her expression that Clara recognized, the same desperate resolve she'd felt on the gallows that morning, and the decision to fight even when the odds were impossible. "There's a special shipment coming through next week," Sarah said quietly. "Not the usual run to the mining camps or the railroad towns. This one's going to Chicago to a man named Blackwood, who specializes in exotic arrangements for wealthy clients. Boone handles these personally when they're worth enough money." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "How much is enough money?" $10,000. For 3 girls, all under 16, all unspoiled. Sarah's voice was thick with disgust. "Boone's been keeping them in the special cells under his mansion, conditioning them for transport. He'll supervise the handover, personally handle the money exchange, even help load them onto the train. It was exactly the kind of direct involvement they needed to prove Boone's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. But it also meant 3 children were going to die horribly unless they could find a way to stop the transaction. When and where? Tuesday night at the old depot outside Silver Creek. The train comes through at midnight, doesn't make regular stops there anymore. Perfect for private transactions. Clara committed the details to memory, already thinking about how to get the information to Elias and Sheriff Drury. This was their chance, not just to gather evidence, but to save the lives of 3 innocent children and strike a blow against Boone's operation that might cripple it permanently. Sarah, I need you to understand something. Once we move on this, there's no going back. Boone will know someone betrayed him, and he'll be looking for revenge. Are you prepared for that? The other woman's smile was grim, but determined. I've been preparing for that possibility since the day I started working for him. The only question was whether I'd die for nothing or die for something that mattered. They parted ways with arrangements for communication and a backup plan if things went wrong. As Clara made her way back to the trading post through moonlit desert, she felt a mixture of hope and terror that made her hands shake and her heart race. They were committed now, locked into a course of action that would end either with Boone's destruction or their own. Elias was waiting for her with news of his own. His surveillance had revealed increased activity around Boone's mansion and the secret tunnels beneath the church. Wagons were being loaded with supplies, men were being positioned at strategic points throughout the county, and money was changing hands in quantities that suggested something major was being planned. He's not just moving the 3 girls to Chicago. Elias reported as they huddled around a shielded candle in the trading post's most protected room. He's planning something bigger. A major expansion of the operation may be relocating the whole base to a more secure location. Which means Tuesday night might be our only chance to stop him. Clara replied, relating what she'd learned from Sarah. If we miss this opportunity, he could disappear entirely, take his operation somewhere we'll never find it. They spent the rest of the night planning their approach to the Silver Creek operation. It would require precise timing coordination with Sheriff Drury's men and more than a little luck. Most importantly, it would require them to abandon the safety of their hiding place and put themselves directly in harm's way. But as Clara lay on her bedroll, staring up at the stars visible through the trading post's broken roof, she found herself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the 3 children locked in cells beneath Boone's mansion. Girls probably not much younger than herself, torn from their families and condemned to lives of unspeakable horror. Unless someone was willing to risk everything to save them. Her father had been willing to take that risk, and it had cost him his life. Now it was her turn to decide whether she had the courage to follow his example regardless of the consequences. The answer, she realized, had never really been in doubt. Tuesday arrived with unseasonable storm clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rain that could either provide cover for their operation or turn the roads into impassable mud. Clara and Elias broke camp before dawn, packing their few possessions and preparing to abandon the trading post that had been their sanctuary for the past week. The plan was complex, but necessarily so. Drury would position his men along the route between Cinder Bluff and Silver Creek, ready to intercept Boone's wagons if the primary operation failed. Elias would approach the depot from the north, using the railroad embankment for cover. Clara would infiltrate from the south, getting close enough to document the transaction and, if possible, free the children before they could be loaded onto the train. It was the kind of plan that required everything to go exactly right, while assuming that at least half of it would go wrong. But it was also their best chance to gather the evidence they needed while saving 3 innocent lives. The old depot at Silver Creek was a relic of the territory's early railroad boom, built when optimistic investors believed the line would continue west to California. When those dreams died, with the Panic of '73, the depot was abandoned in favor of more practical locations, leaving behind a substantial building and loading platform that provided perfect cover for illegal transactions. Clara reached her position just as the sun was setting, concealing herself in a maintenance shed, that provided a clear view of the platform while offering multiple escape routes if things went bad. The storm clouds were building steadily, turning the sky the color of old blood and bringing the kind of oppressive heat that made every breath feel like work. Boone arrived at 11:30, leading a small convoy of wagons and armed men. Clara watched through a crack in the shed's wall as he directed the positioning of his forces with military precision, posting guards at every approach and setting up the transaction site on the platform itself. The children were in the second wagon, 3 small forms huddled together under canvas that couldn't quite hide their terror. Even at a distance, Clara could see that they'd been drugged. Their movements were slow and uncoordinated, their heads lolling as if they were fighting to stay conscious. The sight filled her with a rage so pure and hot that she had to grip the wall of the shed to keep from charging out into the open. These weren't just victims of circumstances or bad luck. They were children who'd been deliberately brutalized and prepared for sale like livestock. The train arrived exactly on schedule, its headlight cutting through the gathering darkness like a malevolent eye. It was a private car attached to a freight engine, expensive and anonymous, the kind of transportation that wealthy men used when they didn't want their business to be anyone else's concern. A single man disembarked impeccably dressed despite the desert heat and carrying a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained the promised payment. Clara couldn't hear the conversation from her hiding place, but she could see the body language of the transaction. The careful inspection of merchandise, the negotiation over price, the gradual movement toward completion. That was when everything went wrong. The first shot came from the railroad embankment where Elias was supposed to be positioned. But instead of the controlled signal they'd planned, it was followed immediately by the rapid fire of multiple weapons and the shouts of men in combat. The transaction dissolved into chaos as Boone's guards dove for cover, and the man from the train scrambled back toward his private car. Clara realized immediately that their plan had been compromised. Boone had been expecting trouble, had positioned additional men in locations they hadn't accounted for. Instead of catching him in the act, they'd walked into a trap that was now closing around all of them. She had perhaps 30 seconds before Boone's men would start searching every possible hiding place in the area. The smart thing would be to run to escape while she still could, and hope that Elias and Drury could extract themselves from the disaster unfolding around the depot. Instead, she ran toward the wagon containing the 3 children. The drugs had left the girls barely conscious, but Clara could see the recognition and desperate hope in their eyes as she cut through the ropes binding their hands. The oldest couldn't have been more than 15, with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. The youngest was maybe 12, small and fragile, and shaking with terror that no amount of laudanum could completely suppress. "Can you walk?" Clara whispered urgently, helping them down from the wagon. "We have to move now." The oldest girl nodded weakly, wrapping her arms around the youngest, while the third child, maybe 13 with blonde hair that had been carefully arranged despite the circumstances, struggled to maintain her balance on drugged legs. They made it perhaps 20 yards before Jake Morrison stepped out from behind the depot building, his pistol trained on Clara's chest, and his face twisted with the kind of satisfaction that came from settling old scores. "Well, well," he drawled loud enough to be heard over the continuing gunfire. "Looks like the reports of your death were greatly exaggerated, Miss Wynne." Clara pushed the 3 girls behind her, trying to shield them with her own body while calculating distances and escape routes. Jake was too far away to rush, too alert to deceive, and too experienced to make mistakes that might create an opening. "Let them go, Jake," she said quietly. "Your quarrel is with me, not with these children. My quarrel is with anyone who costs me money." Jake replied, his gun steady despite the chaos around them. "And you've cost Mr. Boone a considerable amount of money tonight." Before Clara could respond, a new voice cut through the night, Sheriff Drury approaching from the direction of the railroad tracks, with his own weapon drawn and trained on Jake's back. "Drop it, Morrison, it's over." For a moment, the 3 of them formed a triangle of mutual threat, each with the power to kill, but none with the advantage of safety. The sound of gunfire was diminishing around the depot, suggesting that one side or the other was gaining the upper hand. But Clara couldn't tell which. Jake's decision was swift and vicious. Instead of surrendering or trying to negotiate, he spun toward Drury with intent to kill. His shot went wide as the sheriff dove sideways, but it bought him the split second he needed to refocus on Clara and the children behind her. Clara saw the muzzle flash and felt the bullet's passage like a hot wind against her cheek. She threw herself backward, carrying the youngest girl to the ground while shouting for the others to run. Drury's return shot took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around, but not putting him down. The next few seconds were a blur of violence and terror. Jake, wounded but still dangerous, tried to finish what he'd started. Drury, caught in the open, rolled desperately behind a pile of railroad ties while working the action of his rifle. And Clara, shielding 3 drugged children with nothing but determination and fury, looked for any weapon or advantage that might keep them all alive. She found it in the form of a heavy wrench that had been left behind by railroad maintenance crews. As Jake limped toward their position, his gun weaving unsteadily but still lethal, Clara grabbed the tool and prepared to make the kind of desperate gamble that her father would have understood. The throw was awkward, launched from a kneeling position while trying to protect the children, but desperation gave it accuracy. The wrench caught Jake in the temple with a wet crack that cut off his curses and sent him tumbling into the desert sand. Silence fell over their immediate area, broken only by the distant shouts of men still fighting around the depot building. Clara gathered the 3 girls close, checking them for injuries, while listening for signs that more of Boone's men might be approaching. Sheriff Drury approached cautiously, his rifle ready, but pointed away from them. In the moonlight, his face was grim, but not without satisfaction. "You all right?" "No, we're alive," Clara replied, which seemed like the best she could hope for under the circumstances. "What about Elias and the rest of Boone's men?" "Grayson's alive, last I saw. Took a bullet in the leg, but nothing that'll kill him. As for Boone..." Drury's expression darkened. "He got away. Soon as the shooting started, he and his closest men disappeared into the desert. Left his hired guns to hold us off while he escaped." The news was disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. Men like Boone didn't survive as long as he had, by taking unnecessary risks or standing and fighting when retreat was the smarter option. But his escape also meant that the immediate danger was far from over. "He'll be back," Clara said with certainty. "He can't afford to let us live, not after tonight. We've seen too much, know too much." "Maybe. But first he'll have to regroup, figure out what went wrong, decide whether to cut his losses or double down on revenge." Drury knelt beside the youngest girl, checking her pulse and examining her pupils. "These children need medical attention. Whatever he gave them, it's strong enough to kill if they don't get proper care." The practical concerns of caring for 3 poisoned children while evading a vengeful crime lord seemed almost overwhelming. But as Clara looked into their faces, young, terrified, but alive, because someone had been willing to fight for them, she felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. This was why her father had been willing to die, not just for abstract justice or legal principles, but for the specific individual lives that hung in the balance when evil men were allowed to operate without opposition. "We get them to Father Miguel," she decided. "He'll know how to treat the drugs, and the church is the safest place in town for people Boone wants to hurt." The journey back to Cinder Bluff was nightmarish. The 3 girls were barely conscious, requiring constant support to walk even short distances. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, turning the desert roads into rivers of mud that made travel treacherous even for healthy adults. But they made it, arriving at St. Sebastian's just as dawn was breaking over the town. Father Miguel took one look at their condition and immediately began preparations for medical care, sending messages to the few trustworthy people in town who might be able to help. Maria Santos arrived within the hour, bringing supplies and the kind of fierce protectiveness that came from losing her own daughter to Boone's network. Martha Hendricks came next her boarding house experience, making her invaluable in caring for traumatized young people. Even Annie Fletcher appeared despite her own troubles carrying blankets and food that she could ill afford to spare. As the morning progressed and the children began to recover from their drugging, Clara found herself part of an impromptu community of women united by shared experience and common purpose. These were people who'd been victimized by Boone's organization, who'd lost daughters and sisters and friends to his network of corruption and violence. But they were also survivors, people who'd found ways to endure and resist, even when formal law enforcement had failed them. Together, they represented something that Boone had never had to deal with before: organized opposition from the very people he'd assumed were powerless to fight back. "He'll come for them," Maria said quietly, as they watched the three girls sleep peacefully for the first time in months. "And when he does, he'll come hard. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about showing everyone in the territory what happens to people who cross him." "Let him come," Martha replied with grim determination. "We've got federal marshals now, evidence that will stand up in court, and enough witnesses to make sure the truth gets out, even if some of us don't survive to tell it." Clara listened to this exchange while tending to the youngest girl who'd whispered her name Lucy during one of her brief periods of consciousness. The child was maybe 11 or 12, with delicate features, and the kind of innocence that made Boone's crimes seem even more monstrous. "What if we don't wait for him to come to us?" Clara asked suddenly. "What if we go after him instead?" The other women looked at her with expressions ranging from interest to concern. Father Miguel, who'd been quietly mixing medicines at his desk, paused in his work to listen. "You're talking about taking the fight to Boone directly," Annie said slowly. "That's not just dangerous, it's suicide. He's got men guns money and the advantage of choosing his own ground. He's also got something to lose now," Clara replied. "His operation is compromised, his reputation is damaged, and he's got federal law enforcement breathing down his neck. He's not the untouchable figure he was a week ago." Elias limped into the church as she was speaking, his left leg bound with bandages, but his eyes alert and determined. The bullet wound was painful, but not crippling, and his expression suggested that he'd been thinking along similar lines. "That Boone's holed up in his mansion," he reported without preamble. "Drury's got men watching the place, but he's not moving against it directly. Says he needs more evidence before he can get federal authorization for a full assault." "More evidence." Clara's voice rose with frustration. "We've got 3 children who are being sold into slavery financial records proving his involvement and eyewitness testimony from multiple sources. What more does he need? Proof that will hold up in territorial court when Boone's lawyers start throwing money around." Elias replied grimly, "What we have is enough to know he's guilty, but maybe not enough to convict him if he's got the right connections and the right judge." The legal realities were frustrating, but undeniable. Boone had spent years building relationships and buying influence throughout the territorial government. Even with solid evidence, there was no guarantee that justice would be served through official channels. "Then we don't rely on official channels," Clara said firmly. "We make sure the evidence gets to people who can't be bought, judges who aren't in Boone's pocket newspapers that will print the truth regardless of who tries to suppress it." It was Sarah Mitchell who provided the breakthrough they needed. She arrived at the church that afternoon carrying a leather satchel that contained the most damning evidence yet assembled against Boone's organization, complete financial records, going back 3 years, correspondence with buyers throughout the territory and beyond, and detailed transportation schedules that proved the scope of the trafficking network. "He kept everything," Sarah explained as they examined the documents by lamplight. "Every transaction, every payment, every arrangement. I think he was planning to use it as insurance proof of how many important people were involved in case anyone tried to throw him to the wolves." The records were devastating. They showed payments to territorial officials, judges, railroad executives, and prominent businessmen in towns throughout Arizona and New Mexico. More importantly, they provided specific details about individual transactions, names, dates, amounts, and destinations that could be verified through independent investigation. This is it, Elias said with satisfaction. This is what we need to bring down, not just Boone, but his entire network. Some of these names. If this gets out, it'll reach all the way to the territorial capital. But even as they celebrated the discovery, Clara felt a growing sense of unease. The evidence was too complete, too convenient. Boone was many things, but he wasn't careless. The idea that he'd keep such detailed records of his criminal activities without additional safeguards didn't fit with what she knew of his character. "Sarah," she said carefully, "how did you get these documents out of Boone's mansion? Wasn't he suspicious after everything that happened at Silver Creek?" The other woman's expression flickered just for an instant, but long enough for Clara to catch the shadow of something that might have been guilt or fear. "He's been distracted, focused on planning his response to the raid. I was able to access his private safe while he was meeting with his lieutenants." It was plausible, but something about Sarah's demeanor set off warning bells in Clara's mind. The bookkeeper was clearly under enormous stress, but there was something else, a tension that suggested she was holding back important information. Before Clara could pursue the matter further, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. Father Miguel moved quickly to the window, peering through the curtains toward the street. "Men with guns," he reported tersely. "A dozen of them, maybe more. They're surrounding the church." Clara felt her blood turn to ice. Somehow Boone had found them. Despite all their precautions, all their careful planning, he'd tracked them to the one place in town they'd thought was safe. "The tunnels," she said urgently. "We can get the children out through the tunnels." "Not all of them," Father Miguel replied grimly. "Boone sealed most of the exits after your escape. The only way out leads directly to his mansion, and I suspect that's exactly where he wants us to go." The trap was closing around them with mechanical precision. Boone had used their rescue of the 3 children to track them back to their allies, and now he was positioned to eliminate everyone who posed a threat to his organization in a single, devastating strike. A voice called out from the street, amplified by a speaking trumpet and heavy with false courtesy. "Father Miguel, we know you're in there, and we know you're harboring fugitives. Send out Clara Wynne and Elias Grayson, and no one else needs to get hurt." It was Samuel Cross Boone's lawyer, trying to maintain a veneer of civilization, even as he orchestrated what was essentially a siege. The offer was meaningless. Boone had no intention of letting any witnesses survive, regardless of what promises were made in the street. "We need to split up," Elias said quietly. "If they want us specifically, we lead them away from the children and the other women. Give everyone else a chance to escape while they're focused on hunting us." It made tactical sense, but Clara found herself reluctant to abandon the people who'd risked everything to help them. These women had already lost so much to Boone's cruelty. Asking them to face additional danger while she and Elias escaped felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been fighting for. "There's another option," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with an emotion Clara couldn't identify. "Boone doesn't know I'm here. If I go out there, tell him I've been trying to track you down myself, I might be able to convince him that you're not in the church." The suggestion was brave, but dangerous. If Boone suspected Sarah of betraying him, her death would be neither quick nor merciful. But it might buy them the time they needed to get the children to safety and organize some kind of effective resistance. Before anyone could respond to Sarah's offer, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the church. Boone's men weren't waiting for negotiations. They were breaking down the front doors with axes and crowbars, preparing to storm the building by force. Clara made her decision in that instant, driven by the same protective instinct that had sent her racing toward 3 drugged children in the middle of a gunfight. Get them to the tunnels, she told Father Miguel, indicating the 3 girls who were just beginning to wake up from their drugged sleep. All of you get them out of here any way you can. Clara, no. Elias started, but she was already moving toward the front of the church, toward the sounds of violence and the men who'd come to kill everyone she'd learned to care about. Someone has to buy you time, she called back over her shoulder. And I'm tired of running from these bastards. The front doors of St. Sebastian's gave way, just as Clara reached the nave, spilling armed men into the sacred space like a flood of violence and malice. She stepped into the aisle between the pews, directly into their line of sight, drawing their attention away from the altar where the others were helping the children toward the hidden entrance to the tunnel system. Looking for me? She called out, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Here I am. The lead gunman, a scarred brute she didn't recognize, smiled with genuine pleasure. Miss Clara Wynne. Mr. Boone's been looking forward to renewing your acquaintance. Behind her, Clara could hear the muffled sounds of people moving through the church, hopefully towards safety. Every second she could keep these men focused on her was another second for the children to get away, another chance for the evidence Sarah had brought to reach people who could use it. Where is Boone? She asked, taking a step backward down the aisle. Too cowardly to come himself? Oh, he's here, the gunman replied, gesturing toward the doorway. Wouldn't miss this for the world. Jediah Boone entered his church like a conquering general flanked by more armed men and wearing an expression of satisfaction that made Clara's skin crawl. He was a large man, well-dressed despite the late hour, with the kind of confidence that came from never having faced serious opposition to his will. Miss Wynne, he said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a social function rather than an armed confrontation in a house of God. You've led us quite a chase. I do hope it was worth the inconvenience. It was worth it to see 3 children sleep safely tonight instead of being shipped off to your friends in Chicago. Clara replied, continuing to back slowly toward the altar. How much were you getting for them, Boone? What's the going price for an 11-year-old girl these days? Boone's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold and reptilian flickered in his eyes. You seem to labor under the impression that this is some kind of moral crusade, my dear. But it's simply business supply and demand market forces, the same principles that built this great nation. You're trafficking in children. I'm providing services that people are willing to pay for. If there weren't buyers, there wouldn't be sellers. Economics miswin the most honest force in human nature. The casual way he discussed the destruction of innocent lives filled Clara with rage so pure it burned like physical fire in her chest. This man had destroyed dozens of families, condemned countless children to lives of unimaginable horror. And he talked about it like it was nothing more than shipping cattle to market. You're a monster, she said simply. I'm a businessman. And you, my dear, are a very expensive inconvenience that I can no longer afford to tolerate. He nodded to his men, and Clara braced herself for the end. She'd bought as much time as she could, said what needed to be said, and made her choice about how she wanted to die. If the others had escaped, if the evidence reached the right people, if justice eventually caught up with Jediah Boone, then her death would have meaning. The gunshot, when it came, was not what she'd expected. Instead of the multiple reports of an execution, there was a single crack from the direction of the altar, followed immediately by Boone's scream of pain and rage. One of his lieutenants dropped his weapon and clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Elias Grayson rose from behind the altar like an avenging angel, his rifle smoking, and his eyes cold as winter stars. Anyone else want to try their luck? The standoff that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like hours. Boone's men had the advantage of numbers, but they were bunched together in the narrow aisle while Elias had cover and high ground. More importantly, the deputy marshal had the look of a man who'd already accepted that he might die here, and who intended to take as many enemies with him as possible. You're outnumbered 10 to 1, Marshal, Boone said, his pleasant facade finally cracking to reveal the vicious predator beneath. "Even if you kill me, my men will tear you apart." "Maybe," Elias replied calmly, "but you'll still be dead." It was Sarah Mitchell who broke the deadlock, emerging from the tunnel entrance behind the altar, with her hands raised and her face pale with terror. "Mr. Boone, please, I tried to stop them. But they were already here when I arrived. The children, the documents, they took everything." Clara felt the world tilt around her as she processed what Sarah was saying. The bookkeeper wasn't a reluctant ally who'd been coerced into helping. She was one of Boone's people sent to infiltrate their group and discover the extent of their knowledge. The documents were false, designed to seem damaging while actually protecting Boone's real network. The ease with which Sarah had accessed them, the convenient timing of her offer to help it, had all been orchestrated to draw them out of hiding and into a trap. "Very good, my dear," Boone said approvingly, "though I'm afraid your cover may be somewhat blown at this point." Sarah's face crumpled with what looked like genuine anguish. "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry." "But Emma, they have Emma, and they said if I didn't—" "There is no Emma," Boone said with casual cruelty. "There never was. Sarah's been working for me since the day she arrived in Cinder Bluff, providing exactly the kind of detailed financial records that federal investigators love to see, all of them carefully crafted to implicate my competitors while concealing my actual operations." The betrayal cut deeper than Clara had expected. She'd trusted Sarah, had believed in the woman's story of coercion and family loyalty. To learn that it had all been a lie, that she'd been manipulated by someone she'd thought was a fellow victim, felt like a physical wound. But it also clarified their situation. The documents were worthless, the supposed evidence was fabricated, and their entire plan had been compromised from the beginning. They were alone, outnumbered, and trapped in a church, with a man who had no intention of letting them leave alive. "Where are the children?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the despair clawing at her chest. "Safe," Boone replied. "For now. Their value depends largely on how cooperative you decide to be in the next few minutes." It was the oldest form of coercion, threatening innocent lives to ensure compliance. Clara had seen her father faced with similar choices, had watched him agonize over decisions that seemed to have no good options. Now she was living the same nightmare, forced to choose between her own principles and the lives of 3 children who'd already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. "What do you want?" "Simple. You and the marshal surrender yourselves to my custody. Submit to questioning about who else might be involved in this investigation, what evidence you might have shared with federal authorities, and how much the territorial government actually knows about my operations. Answer truthfully, and the children will be released unharmed." The offer was meaningless. Boone had no intention of releasing anyone who could testify against him. But it bought time, and time was the one thing they desperately needed if there was any chance of rescue or escape. "And if we refuse?" Boone's smile was reptilian. "Then this church becomes a charnel house, and 3 young girls learn exactly why crossing me is such a fatal mistake." Clara looked at Elias, saw her own desperation reflected in his pale eyes. They were beaten, outmaneuvered by a man who'd been playing this game for years, while they'd stumbled through it like amateurs. But even in defeat, there might be opportunities, chances to turn the tables, or at least ensure that some good came from their sacrifice. "I'll come with you," she said finally. "But let the marshal go. He's federal law enforcement. Killing him will bring more heat than you can handle." "Noble but impractical," Boone replied. "Marshal Grayson knows too much to be allowed to carry tales back to his superiors. Besides, I have plans for both of you that require your continued cooperation." Before Clara could ask what those plans might involve, the sound of horses approaching at high speed echoed through the night air. Boone's men shifted nervously, unsure whether the newcomers represented reinforcements or threats. Through the broken doors of the church, Clara could see torches and lanterns moving through the darkness, too many to count, approaching from multiple directions. Sheriff Drury, one of Boone's lieutenants, reported tersely. With what looks like half the territorial militia. Boone's expression darkened. The careful control he'd maintained throughout the confrontation was beginning to crack, revealing the violent man beneath the civilized facade. How many? 30, maybe 40, armed and positioned to surround the church. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. Instead of a controlled execution in an isolated location, Boone now faced the prospect of a pitched battle with territorial law enforcement. Even if he won, the cost would be enormous. Too many witnesses, too much official attention, too many questions that his network of corruption might not be able to suppress. The new plan, he said grimly. We take these two as hostages and negotiate our way out of town. Once we're clear, we can deal with them properly. It was a reasonable strategy under the circumstances, but it required his men to remain calm and disciplined under pressure. Unfortunately for Boone, his hired guns were thugs and killers, rather than soldiers brave enough when they had overwhelming advantages, but prone to panic when faced with organized opposition. The first sign of trouble came when Sheriff Drury's voice echoed across the town square, amplified by a speaking trumpet and carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. Jediah Boone, you are surrounded by territorial marshals and federal agents. Release your hostages and surrender yourself for arrest on charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and murder. The formal language of law enforcement had a visible effect on several of Boone's men. These were criminals who'd operated in the shadows, relying on corruption and intimidation rather than direct confrontation with legitimate authority. The realization that they were now facing federal charges, offenses that couldn't be fixed with local bribes or political connections, sent ripples of fear through their ranks. Stand fast, Boone commanded, but Clara could hear the strain in his voice. They're bluffing. Half those men are locals who've been taking my money for years. They won't risk a firefight over a few missing girls. He was wrong, and Clara could see that he was beginning to realize it. The investigation had reached critical mass, attracting federal attention that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Even if some local officials were compromised, there were enough honest lawmen in the group outside to ensure that justice would be served. The second sign of trouble came when one of Boone's men, a nervous young gunslinger who looked like he was having second thoughts about his career choices, began edging toward the back of the church. His movement was subtle, but in the confined space, it was impossible to hide completely. Where do you think you're going, Billy? Boone's voice was soft but deadly. The young man froze his hand halfway to his gun. I was just checking the back exit, Mr. Boone, making sure we got all the escape routes covered. Of course you were. Boone's smile was devoid of warmth, and it has nothing to do with the fact that federal marshals are offering amnesty to anyone who provides information about my organization. The young gunslinger's face went pale. Mr. Boone, I swear, the gunshot cut off his protests and sent his body crashing into the pews behind him. Boone lowered his smoking pistol with the casual air of a man swatting a fly, apparently unconcerned that he'd just murdered one of his own men in full view of multiple witnesses. Anyone else having doubts about their loyalty? He asked pleasantly. The murder had exactly the opposite effect from what Boone had intended. Instead of cowing his remaining men into obedience, it demonstrated that he was losing control, becoming desperate enough to kill his own people. Several of the gunmen exchanged meaningful glances, and Clara could see them calculating odds and considering options. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but that deterioration might create opportunities for escape or rescue. If Boone's men decided to abandon him, or if Drury's forces decided to storm the church, the resulting chaos might provide cover for getting away. The opportunity came sooner than expected in the form of a small, desperate figure that appeared in the tunnel entrance behind the altar. Lucy, the youngest of the three rescued children, had somehow escaped from wherever Boone's men were holding them and made her way back through the underground passages. She was filthy terrified and bleeding from cuts on her hands and knees, but her eyes blazed with the kind of determination that Clara recognized from her own mirror. This child had decided to fight back, regardless of the odds against her. "The others are in the basement under the saloon," Lucy whispered urgently to Elias, apparently unaware that every person in the church could hear her clearly. "There's maybe 4 men guarding them, but they're drunk and not paying much attention." The information was invaluable, but its public delivery was catastrophic. Boone's expression went from controlled anger to homicidal rage as he realized that his ace in the hole, the 3 children he'd been holding as leverage, might no longer be under his control. "Kill them all," he snarled to his remaining men. "Every goddamned one of them. We'll shoot our way out and burn this whole fucking town to the ground if we have to." The veneer of civilization was gone, now replaced by the savage brutality that had always lurked beneath Boone's polished surface. But his order also triggered the final collapse of discipline among his men. Several of them looked appalled at the prospect of murdering women and children in a church, while others were clearly calculating whether their loyalty to Boone was worth facing federal charges for mass murder. The chaos that followed was swift and brutal. 2 of Boone's men turned their guns on him instead of on his intended victims, apparently deciding that their best chance of survival lay in eliminating their employer rather than following his increasingly unhinged orders. Boone shot one of them before diving for cover behind an overturned pew, while the other returned fire and sent splinters flying from the wooden benches. Elias used the confusion to grab Clara and Lucy, pulling them toward the tunnel entrance, while gunfire erupted throughout the church. Sarah Mitchell screamed and tried to follow them, apparently realizing that her usefulness to Boone had ended and that she was likely to be the next victim of his paranoid rage. The tunnel system beneath St. Sebastian's was a maze of interconnected passages, some dating back to the original Spanish missions, and others carved more recently by people seeking to move through the town without being observed. In the darkness, with gunfire echoing from the church above, it felt like descending into hell itself. But Lucy knew the passages better than any of them, having apparently spent considerable time exploring them during her captivity. She led them through twists and turns that Clara couldn't have navigated in daylight, moving with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every stone and support beam. "This way leads to the saloon," she explained as they hurried through the darkness. "The other girls are in a room right under the main bar. There's a trapdoor hidden behind some barrels." The saloon was Boone's primary business in town, the legitimate front that concealed his other activities. It would be heavily defended under normal circumstances, but the chaos at the church might have drawn away some of the guards. If they could reach the other 2 children and get them to safety, they might still salvage something from this disaster. The tunnel that led to the saloon was narrower and more treacherous than the others, requiring them to crawl through sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued to echo through the underground network, shouts, gunshots, and the crash of falling masonry, as the church above was torn apart by violence. They emerged in the saloon's basement through a concealed entrance behind stacks of whiskey barrels, just as Lucy had described. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, and Clara could immediately see the huddled forms of the 2 other rescued children in a makeshift cell constructed from scrap lumber and iron bars. The guards were indeed drunk, as Lucy had reported, but they were also alert enough to notice the sound of the hidden door opening. One of them was reaching for his gun when Elias put a bullet through his chest, while the other stumbled backward and knocked over a table full of bottles before Clara could club him unconscious with a piece of broken furniture. The 2 girls, Mary and Rebecca, both around 13 or 14, were conscious, but drugged, able to walk with assistance, but not much more. Getting them out of the basement and to safety would require time and care that they might not have, especially with the battle raging above ground and unknown numbers of Boone's men still at large. "Can we get back to the church through the tunnels?" Clara asked Lucy, who seemed to be the only one among them who truly understood the underground network. "Not anymore," Lucy replied with the matter-of-fact tone that children used when discussing disaster. I heard explosions before I found you. I think they're collapsing the tunnels to keep people from escaping." The news was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. Boone had used the tunnel system for his own purposes, but he'd also recognized it as a vulnerability that could be exploited by his enemies. If he was losing control of the situation above ground, destroying the underground passages would prevent anyone from using them to outflank his position. It also meant that they were trapped in the saloon's basement with limited options for escape. The building above was likely occupied by Boone's men, while the streets outside were probably controlled by Drury's forces. Getting 5 people, 2 of them barely conscious children, out of this situation would require either extraordinary luck or extraordinary sacrifice. The decision was made for them by the sound of boots on the stairs leading down from the saloon's main floor. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that suggested multiple men moving with military precision. Clara counted at least 4 distinct sets of boots, probably more. "Federal marshals," a voice called down the stairs. "Anyone down there needs to identify themselves immediately." It was Sheriff Drury, his voice tight with stress, but carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement. Clara felt a surge of hope, so intense, it was almost painful. They weren't alone, they weren't abandoned, and there might still be a chance to get the children to safety. "Sheriff, it's Clara Wynne," she called back. "I'm here with Deputy Marshal Grayson and 3 children who are being held prisoner. We need medical assistance and safe transport." The footsteps on the stairs quickened, and within moments, the basement was filled with armed men, wearing the badges of territorial and federal law enforcement. Drury himself looked haggard, but determined, his uniform torn and stained with smoke from the battle at the church. "Thank God you're alive," he said with obvious relief. "When the church started burning, we thought—" He shook his head, apparently unwilling to voice his fears. "What happened to Boone? Last I saw, his own men were shooting at him." Clara replied, helping Mary stand while one of the marshals examined Rebecca's condition. "The whole thing fell apart when he started killing his own people." "He's dead," Drury confirmed grimly. "Found his body in the church after we put out the fire. Looks like he caught a bullet in the back, probably from one of his own men trying to save their own skins." The news should have felt like victory, but Clara found herself strangely empty. Jediah Boone was dead, his organization was destroyed, and 3 innocent children were free from captivity. Justice had been served after a fashion. But the cost had been enormous. The church was destroyed, several good people were dead, and the scars left by Boone's activities would take years to heal. What about Sarah Mitchell? She asked, remembering the terrified woman who'd been caught between competing loyalties and impossible choices. "Alive but injured," Drury replied. "Took a bullet in the shoulder during the shootout. She's been asking to speak with you, actually. Says she has information about the rest of Boone's network people and places we haven't identified yet." It was possible that Sarah was still trying to manipulate the situation, feeding them false information to protect other parts of the criminal organization. But it was also possible that she was genuinely repentant, willing to risk everything to make amends for the role she'd played in Boone's crimes. Either way, Clara realized she wasn't ready to make that judgment. The events of the past week had taught her that the line between victim and perpetrator was often thinner than she'd imagined, and that good people sometimes did terrible things when faced with impossible circumstances. The evacuation from the saloon basement was conducted with military efficiency. The 3 rescued children were transferred to a medical wagon that had been brought in from Fort Lowell, while Clara and Elias were debriefed by federal marshals who seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had happened and why. As dawn broke over Cinder Bluff, the full extent of the night's carnage became visible. The church was a smoking ruin, its roof collapsed and its walls blackened by fire. The saloon had suffered significant damage during the raid, with broken windows and bullet holes marking the sites of fierce fighting. Several other buildings showed signs of battle, testament to the running gunfights that had raged through the town streets. But there were also signs of hope. The women who'd helped shelter and protect the rescued children were gathering in Martha Hendricks' boarding house, sharing food and comfort, while they processed the trauma of the night's events. Father Miguel, despite the loss of his church, was already making plans to hold services in the schoolhouse until a new building could be constructed. Most importantly, word was spreading through the territorial capital about the scope of Boone's network and the corruption that had allowed it to flourish. Federal investigators were being dispatched to examine the books of every official who'd had dealings with Boone, while grand juries were being convened to hear testimony from witnesses who'd been too frightened to speak before. It wouldn't bring back the girls who'd already been lost, but it might prevent future tragedies and ensure that justice was served for those who'd profited from human misery. 3 days later, Clara stood in the ruins of St. Sebastian's Church, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but it was gradually being replaced by the sense of new construction as the town began to rebuild. Elias approached from the direction of the sheriff's office, his limp barely noticeable, as his leg wound continued to heal. In his hand, he carried a telegram that bore the seal of the territorial marshal's office. "Good news or bad news?" Clara asked, accepting the telegram and scanning its contents. "Both, I suppose. The good news is that Boone's network is collapsing faster than we'd hoped. Arrests in Denver, Phoenix, and Tucson. 3 territorial judges have resigned under investigation. The railroad companies are cooperating with federal authorities rather than risk their government contracts. And the bad news? Some of the key figures escaped before we could arrest them, including the man who was supposed to receive the 3 girls in Chicago. He's disappeared along with enough money and connections to start the whole operation over again somewhere else." Clara nodded, unsurprised by the news. Organizations like Boone's were like weeds. Cut them down in one place and they'd sprout up in another. The fight against human trafficking would continue long after the events in Cinder Bluff were forgotten by everyone except the people who'd lived through them. "There's something else." Elias continued, his voice carefully neutral. "The marshal's office has offered me a promotion. Supervisory position in Denver, overseeing investigations into organized crime throughout the Western Territories. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a career, a chance to make a real difference on a scale that dwarfed what they'd accomplished in Cinder Bluff. Clara should have been happy for him, proud that his courage and competence were being recognized by his superiors. Instead, she felt a hollowness in her chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. "Congratulations," she said, forcing a smile. "Denver's lucky to